going on, everybody? You're tuning into another episode of 20 Minutes. I am your host, Tim McCarthy. Today, we have on an Amazon best-selling author, an award-winning musician, and a mental health and disability advocate, Heather Hutchinson. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great today. Thank you for asking.
Awesome.
Let's ask this. I do this with all my guests right away. What does mental health mean to you?
That's a really interesting question because, there are the technical definitions, but I always picture mental health as this like long, meandering pathway or road that is like dotted with the decisions, the healthy decisions that we learn to make and the ways in which we learn to cope and learn to deal with the difficulties that come into our paths.
That's a great answer. I like that a lot. Um, so you happen to be blind. How long have you been blind?
I've been blind since birth.
Okay. How does being blind affect your mental health?
I think it's so multifaceted. I get that question a lot, and people are like, "Oh, are you depressed because 'cause you're blind?" I mean, I think that you can relate it back to that, but there's so many things, there's genetics, there's environment. I think disability certainly does play a part in it. Almost like people with disabilities are almost 5 times more likely to report having mental health challenges. So, yeah, I think it's definitely can play into it, but more, because of not so much. I think people always think, "Oh, you must be so depressed because like, you can't see the sunset in your loved ones' faces." No, it's more the isolation that comes from society's views of people with disabilities as being different, as being unequal, as being incapable
Is there a name to the diagnosis?
of
Being
mental health
blind. No,
challenges.
being
Oh.
blind.
Oh, like, my diagnosis specifically is called
Yeah.
Leber congenital amaurosis.
Okay.
Say
I
that
always
10
like
times
I
fast.
always like learning something new. I wanted to know the official like terminology of it all. But
Yes.
what are some annoying questions you get about being blind? Because I feel like a lot of people do have questions, and I feel like a lot of them are probably not that great.
No, it's true. I think the person who coined the the phrase "there are no stupid questions" forgot about Google. Like, there are really some things that you should Google and not ask a random stranger in public.
Yeah.
Some annoying questions I get online all the time. "Well, if you're blind, how are you reading the comments? You can't really be blind." Um What do your dreams look like? These questions aren't necessarily annoying in themselves as they're annoying in the frequency in which they get asked. And then there's some like really awkward ones like how do you know when you're done wiping? Yeah, that one comes up a lot and that's weird because I don't know why people think about that.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that that's the first thing they would think about, and especially to ask you in such a private thing that you do.
Yeah, it's bizarre, but it's like when you have a disability, people ask all kinds of private things, and it's like there's no boundaries. They feel like they can ask whatever, and we should be happy to answer it at any time.
That's very true. If you think about it, we're all created equal, and you wouldn't ask that to somebody that isn't blind. So what makes it okay in their mind that you can ask that?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I always tell the people. People ask me, "Well, how do I if I'm curious, how do I go up to somebody in public and ask them about their blindness?" And I'm like, "Well, short answer, you don't, because if it's not something that you would ask somebody else, a sighted person, you shouldn't be asking a blind person that either. You can find out like we have more information available to us now than ever with the internet and TikTok and Instagram and people with disabilities posting on there, you can find answers to your questions. Google, you don't need to be going up and asking weird questions to strangers in public.
I think your Instagram Reels and TikTok explain that very well. I commend you on doing those videos because they are funny in a way sometimes. I don't know if you're trying to be humorous in a way, but you do have a good sense about yourself when you do talk about those topics, about what you go through.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's more relatable to people if you can approach it with humor. Then they don't feel quite like they're being lectured as much. And also for me, like sometimes you gotta laugh or you're gonna cry. So
Yeah. I was actually going to ask that. Do you consider humor to be useful during periods of struggle?
Definitely, yeah, I think you can get to a point where you're so far down that you can't find the humor in anything, and I think with practice, you learn to spot those dips coming so that you can take appropriate action to avoid getting into a place where you can't dig yourself out, and I think a big part of, when you first start to notice going down is trying to deal with it with humor.
Yeah, I feel like humor is like one of the best medicines that you can have. I use a lot of humor and self-deprecating for myself. That's how I use it.
Mhm.
But I do think humor is a plays a big part in trying to be more positive in a way when you're in a dark place.
Yeah, I totally agree, and people are like, "Oh, you shouldn't use humor when you're talking about mental health," but I think sometimes humor can make the harder topics just that little bit more accessible.
Yeah, I've gotten comments like that too, that they think I'm using mental health in a wrong way just because I joke about it. I don't make fun of mental health, but you gotta let people in by joking, I feel like let them in on the quote unquote joke.
Yeah.
So we can treat it like so easy to talk about because like you said a minute ago, it's like you're not like scolding people or talking down to them. I feel like a lot of professionals talk about mental health where you can go talk to them and learn about it, but then there's real life people like me and you that are going through separate things, but we can go and open up about it to let people in.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think there's, points for both. I think professional mental health help is very important too, but then also people, listening to the experience of people who are in the trenches currently and, what's working for them, what isn't, and just to know that, not only is there professional help available to you, but there's also your peers who are going through the same kind of struggles.
This is a question for you because you're pretty good on TikTok. What do you feel about the profiles on TikTok that kind of talk about mental health, but they're not like usually educated as well? It's somebody that's like, oh, I think I have ADHD because I do this and that. But usually that could be more harm than good. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I feel like right now, this is a little controversial, but I feel like we're in such a lonely place in a world right now that everybody wants to have a diagnosis, so we're kind of giving ourselves diagnoses so that we feel more, part of this group because we're feeling so alone. And I think, yeah, that definitely can be harmful. You have to really pay attention to what media you're consuming on the internet because somebody who just, feels like they have this certain thing and is going to tell you that this is unequivocally, how you fix this or get better or whatever. I don't know if you saw, I did a reel recently talking about how I'm a mental health advocate and I still struggle. When I was at the worst of my mental illness, I would get so frustrated because there would be influencers talking about mental health and they'd be like, oh, I was in a really dark place once, but I'm all better now, living like hashtag living my best life. And it's just not really that helpful to people, I don't think. Maybe it makes that person feel better to post those sorts of things, but it's not terribly relatable when somebody's actually going through it.
Exactly. And I read about this because I take Adderall for my medications and there was a shortage. And I read an article that said that TikTok was a big reason for that because kids were seeing other people talk about it. So they went to their PCPs and, uh, and they think that they have ADHD. So they were prescribed that. So there was a shortage in Adderall. And I thought that was just mind
Wow.
blowing to me.
Wow. I mean, I guess that brings new meaning to the phrase TikTok made me buy it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow.
I know you said Google was a big one, but I'm curious to know, like, if people are curious and they want to know more, how should they tackle certain questions? Obviously, they shouldn't go up to people, but is Google just the answer?
I think with TikTok and Instagram, there are so many people now that you can follow. There's hashtags. We have blind talk on TikTok or disability TikTok. There's so many places online where you can actually hear from people who are living it day to day.
Mm.
So I think that's a great way to learn. And a lot of those people are happy to answer questions. I'm usually happy to answer questions online because it's different for me. Online, I've put myself out there as somebody who advocates for disability, and I can control those interactions. I see it completely differently than somebody just randomly coming up to me on the street and being like, "Hey, what's it like to be blind?" Because then I can choose the time when I'm in the right headspace to answer the questions. I can choose what questions I'm going to answer and how I will choose to interact with that person. So I'm happy to answer questions online. And then I think just get to know people as people, don't go up to somebody on the street and be like, "Oh, what's it like to be blind?" when you haven't even, or "Were you born blind?" I get that a lot, and it's like, you didn't even ask me my name and you want
Uh,
my my medical history, like, what is going on here? So get to know people as people. Go up to that person and say you like their shirt or something, start up a conversation, start up a friendship, and I think as that friendship blossoms, if it does, you're gonna see that your questions will just sort of get answered because you're gonna observe that people are just people, and we're so much more alike than we are unalike.
have people really just come up to you and asked you that straight up? Like,
Oh,
really?
yeah. Oh, yeah, and I'm like, I've never done it. I've managed to keep my inside voice inside for the most part, but I've always wanted to be like, were you born stupid?" Like, who does that?
Right. Like, I don't like using the term crazy. Like, I have a mental illness, and people would be like, "Oh, you're crazy." Like, I can accept that. Like, I don't use it, but like, some people out there are legit crazy, and I think that's one of the
Oh,
craziest things you
I
can
know.
do, and go up to a random person and just ask them a question about their personal life.
Yeah, it's so entitled, it blows my mind.
Do you ever get patronized?
All the time, yeah, I was just thinking about this the other day, a friend and I were talking about it. She's my best friend, and we go to this store sometimes in her neighborhood, and there's this certain cashier that we always seem to get, and she talks normally to everybody else, and then I'll get up there and I'll tap my credit card, and she'll be like, "Oh, good job, sweetie."
Oh
Like
no.
like I'm 2 years old and I just used the potty for the first time, like, that's literally how it feels, and, yeah, I was that's an example that I was just thinking about recently, but it happens all the time. People adopt this, like, really weird, sweet voice, like you're talking to a child or an animal or something like that, and it's like, I do understand you when you speak normally.
Yeah. And it's like that's like two sides of the coin because people just go up to you and ask you questions, but there's people that patronize you, and it's like they have to find the middle ground, and it's not that hard to do that.
Yeah, it's like the pendulum is either on one side or another, and we can't just seem to find the middle.
Do you ever get frustrated being blind?
I do, and it's not so much like I was talking about earlier, where people assume that it's because I can't see things, the beauty in this world or whatever, and I say to them that there's lots of different ways to see the beauty in this world. Um, But it's the perceptions that are very frustrating, it's the things that aren't accessible in 2023 that should be accessible, we should know better, and there are days when, it's noon, I've dealt with, like, 5 accessibility issues already that day, I've gotten a bunch of ableist comments online, and it's just like, it does get disheartening sometimes because it's like, when is this gonna change? I'm working as hard as I can to make it change. There are a lot of other people who are working as hard as they can to invoke change, and it's just not happening as fast as we'd like it to. So that's probably the most frustrating part.
When we first chatted before we recorded, I asked you this question. You're not in the States, right?
No.
So all of our money and currency are the same size. Do you think that's something that they should change? Like, how is it being in Canada, right?
Yeah, so in Canada, we actually have tactile markers on our bills. They're not like proper braille, but they're sort of braille. Basically, that it just has like a full character. So we have one full braille character that means like $5 bills. So it doesn't actually say five. It's just one of these full characters, two for 10, etc., etc.
I feel like people in the States, I would feel like that would be very frustrating in a way, especially like you have to figure out like because they're all the same size.
Yeah, our bills are too. We just have those tactile markers on them.
The states need to get up to par with that. I feel like we're always a little bit behind on everybody else.
It's so weird because you guys you are in a way, like, on money, but then you guys have the ADA, and we haven't had anything like the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act, and so, like, when I travel to the US, I'm always pretty impressed by, like, the infrastructure that you guys have to deal with disability that we just don't have here.
Really? Like, do you guys not have like accessibility like ramps or anything that much? Because I know people in wheelchairs with disabilities, like we have we need ramps pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, we do, but I wouldn't say that accessibility features are as widely, used or available here in Canada just because you guys have had that legislation for so long and
Mhm.
we haven't.
That's very how come you think that is?
Um, I think in that aspect, Canada needs to get with the times. It's crazy to crazy. There we go. It's absurd to me that we don't that we are so far behind when we're supposed to be, this progressive country, and we don't have disability legislation that came into effect years and years and years ago in the states.
Do you read Braille?
I do, yeah.
How's that? Does it take a long time to learn?
Not I think it's harder when you're older for sure. A lot of people find it, like sighted people who learn to read Braille, most of them can't do it with their fingers. It's just too hard. So they'll actually learn Braille like by looking at it. There's only about 10% of blind and visually impaired people who do read Braille, and that number is going down, which is very scary. Um, so it's challenging to learn, especially due to the fact that there just aren't that many people out there who can teach it.
Right. How was it growing up being blind, being a child? Do you have any experiences that were pretty tough for you?
Yeah, it was I think up till a certain age, you're kinda living in this bubble, and so for me, I was about 5 when the bubble burst. Up until that point, I was really just hanging out with my brother and my cousins and, my family, and I was just me, and it was never, like, a secret that was kept from me. I did kinda wonder sometimes why people seemed to know things that I didn't, and it was because they could see them and I couldn't.
Right.
Um, but I was just me, right? And then I started having more exposure to the big wide world, and that's when I started realizing I was different, and different was not necessarily a good thing. I can remember being on vacation with my family. I would have been 5, and I was playing with this kid on the playground who was a couple years older than me, and we made quick friends and had a lovely afternoon playing together on the playground. And at one point, he asked me why I never looked at anything, and just super matter of fact, I'm like, "Oh, because I'm blind." Just as you'd tell somebody, "Oh, I have brown hair and blue eyes, no big deal." And, obviously, he thought it was a big deal because he I was standing at the top of the slide, and he pushed me off the platform, that was at the top of the slide, so I went flying backwards, and he flew down the slide, yelled some insult about me being blind, jumped on his bike, and pedaled away, and he didn't come back. And so I remember lying there, and that was, like, really the first moment where I realized, "Hey, I'm different, and
Mm.
different is bad."
That's a heartbreaking story.
Yeah, it was tough for sure, and I think of that kid too, and, he learned that from somewhere, so I hope that he got the help he needed because obviously he needed it.
Kids can be like the worst sometimes because they have no filter whatsoever. And I feel like that's the case. Hopefully, that person grew up and learned some lessons after that.
I hope so, yeah, that's true, kids don't have a filter, but I think, when they're really little, it's kinda like this innocence about them where they're just like open to learning about the world and asking questions, and I think that's a positive thing.
Mhm.
I think for that kid, he was obviously taught somewhere along the way that like differences are bad and to be feared and things like that. So I think he probably had some of his own struggles.
Definitely. On this show, we're pretty familiar with what a mental health advocate is because I am one. Can you tell us what goes into being a disability advocate?
I think it's pretty well quite similar because I try to do both, and I try to do both in very similar ways. So a lot of it is just education of the general public, as well as education of, people who can make the important decisions, for changes that we need to see. So, sharing stories with government, with law enforcement agencies, with, anybody who has the power to change things. Because, even if they're doing these kinds of things day in, day out, I think actually hearing from somebody who's living it
Mhm.
is invaluable to actually getting things done and changed.
Is there anything specific people can do to help or be more aware of people with disabilities?
I think so often people will see us on the street and they'll feel pity, and that's really unfortunate because that doesn't help them and that doesn't help us. What we really need is allies. So we need people to help us spread the message, when they get educated about something, spread that to other people if it comes up in conversation. If you have the chance to hire somebody with a disability, do it. They're often really good workers because we live in a world that requires us to be very creative in the ways we think and in the ways that we solve problems. So that can be a huge asset. And, when you see ableism, when you see people being bullied because of a disability, because of, a mental health struggle, say something. Don't just let it pass by because those attitudes are being, further carried forward, and those don't go away on their own. So we need allies to help us in that kind of fight.
I think a lot of people just learn on their own. When I was a kid, I remember someone who was blind was having a tough time getting around, and I saw like a stranger help that person, and I was like, "Oh, okay, like pay it forward a little bit. Like that's what I should do." So when it came to time where like I interacted with someone who happened to be blind, they didn't want help from me whatsoever, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So I knew like the both sides of the coin on that. It's like I can't patronize people being like, "Oh, he's blind. Let me help him cross the street." Like he was fine by himself and I kind of like interrupted him, and I think you learn that, so you find the middle ground. So I had the experience for both, and I'm actually glad that kind of happened to me, so I knew how to use that going forward.
Yeah, for sure. The good thing there is that you're perceptive. A lot of people aren't. So that's, they take that as, I hear that all the time. Like, oh, I tried to help this blind person. I just came up and grabbed them and they weren't very happy about it. And I'm like, yeah, would you be?
Yeah, right. Let's switch over to this. You're an award-winning singer. What got you into singing?
I think it was actually my battles with mental health that made singing so important for me. I mean, I always loved it since I was very young. I remember being like 6 years old, and I always carried this Fisher Price tape recorder with one of those mics around with me. And I was always like making up songs and stories. And my brother offered to lend me $100 to record an album, which I later found out was not nearly enough to record an album. But then as I started to struggle more with my mental health in, my early teen years, I really turned to songwriting, to try and help me figure out what was going on in my
Right.
head. And I would sit down at the piano and write about how I was feeling, and it helped things to make sense. And, then I met my first producer when I was 15 at a talent competition, and we ended up, doing recording 2 albums together. And so my first album came out when I was 16, and I remember, like, performing in these shows after it came out, and people would come up to me and be like, "Oh, this song really helped me through this really difficult situation that I was going through." And I think that I really thrived on the human connection that music brings, that, this realization that we're not alone in these battles that we're fighting. And I think that's the human connection of music is really what's carried me through.
And I read this too. You can sing in Spanish.
Yes.
When did you learn that?
It was honestly always something, like, I grew up fairly surrounded as much as I could with the Latin American community in Canada. I find honestly that this is a huge generalization, but people in Canada have one of two responses to my blindness. They either like pretend that it doesn't exist to where there's like this big elephant in the room, or they try and pretend that they're totally cool with it by cracking jokes all the
Mm,
time. And I like a good blind joke as much as the next person, but they're not funny anymore when you've heard them all 1,000 times.
yeah.
In comparison, I feel like the Latin people that I've met, they're always super just they meet people where they're at, and they don't get awkward around me. They ask way fewer invasive questions, so I've always really loved that, and then, as soon as I could, I actually moved to a different continent. I moved to South America,
Oh, wow.
because I wanted to be different for a different reason. So, yeah, that's how I learned Spanish.
So a lot of your songs are around mental health. Talk about your songs a little bit. Is there any like specific songs that are like pertain to mental health? Like what exactly are you singing about?
Yeah, so, my book's actually called Holding On by Letting Go, and a couple of months after my book came out, I released an album called If I Could, and a lot of people were joking that it should have been called Holding On by Letting Go, the musical, because it really took the experiences that I lived in my memoir and turned them into songs. So, there's songs that talk about the loneliness and the isolation, um, of being hospitalized for psychiatric care, maybe not in as many words, maybe they're a little bit more, I try to be universal, but I think those feelings can be so universal. I think probably the song that I've written that to me is most about mental health is actually called If I Could. And, you asked me at the beginning what mental health means to me. And there's a line in this song that I think basically sums it up to me. It says, "It's not a finish line, it's a choice you make each day."
I love it. I absolutely love it. So where can people actually buy that book? On Amazon, your website? Where can they go?
Yeah, basically anywhere you get books. If you go to my website, there's a big list of places you can get it. But Amazon, Audible, there's an audiobook as well. Barnes& and Noble, Apple Books, et cetera, et cetera.
Fantastic. All right. Can I ask some curious questions?
Yeah, go for it.
So when it comes to writing a book or writing lyrics, do you type them down and it reads back to you? Do you write in Braille? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it is a thing. I usually type, it's just easier for me at this point. I wrote exclusively in Braille up until grade 9, and then they basically took that away, and they're like, "No, here's your laptop, you're typing
Mm.
from now on." So I can write in both, but I typically nowadays, just write using a QWERTY keyboard, and then I listen back, when I was writing my book, but I also proofread it in Braille, so I have what's called a refreshable Braille display, which connects to my computer via Bluetooth, and then mine has 40 cells or Braille characters, and then the dots just, like, move up and down as you advance, and it reads everything, so you can read everything. It shows everything on the screen in Braille.
What's something that someone wouldn't know that being blind? What is something that like you go through that someone might not know being blind?
We're really good, like, backseat drivers or navigators. Like, if you're lost, ask a blind person for help because we have really specific directions. We're not gonna tell you, "Oh, I think it's, like, a couple blocks down that way." We're gonna be like, "No, you walk 2 blocks, you cross the metal bridge, you'll come to the Starbucks, and it's on the left." And yes, we can smell the Starbucks, and it smells different than other coffee shops.
That's wicked funny, and I feel like Starbucks does that on purpose.
I think they do, yeah, like, I can't put my finger on because people are like, "Well, how does it smell different?" I'm like, "I don't know, it just smells like Starbucks. It's different."
Exa See, that was a great answer to my question. That was a good question.
Yeah, that was a tough I was like, "Oh, I don't know, because usually it's, like, the typical, like, "Oh, well, don't do this," or, like, "This is how you can offer help to a blind person," or, "This is how you can guide a blind person," things like that, but I felt like your question, like, went a little deeper, so I was like, "Oh, man, I don't know."
That's always a win for me. I like asking questions that are a little bit tougher, they're actually pretty good, so I'm glad that you got to answer that for me.
But then I always feel like there's, like, this awkward silence of, like, the Jeopardy music.
That's what the great thing about editing is.
I know, right? Yeah, thank gosh for editing. But some
So
people don't, so
yeah, no, I feel ya. The dead space, you gotta go. You know how it is.
yes, yes, thankfully.
So you're big on Instagram and TikTok. Where can people find you on both of those?
So I'm on both of those, I'm at Heather Hutchison Music.
Perfect. Now here's another curious question. How is it running a social media? Do you have help? Do you do it by yourself? What are some things that go into that?
Okay, that's an easier question. I was, like, nervous there for a second. Um, I don't have a social media manager, so people are always like, "Oh, are you actually reading the comments?" Yes, it's actually me reading the comments. Yes, I can read the
Yeah.
comments and respond to them. I have accessibility features on my phone that lets me do that. And then my partner's actually big into video editing, so he actually edits the videos and helps with, like, the lighting and things like that. Because I can put a camera in front of me, but I'm not gonna notice, like, the little nuances of lighting and things like that, so that's really helpful. So we run it together.
Teamwork makes the dream work. Am I right?
Exactly.
What does self care look like for Heather Hutchinson?
Self-care to me sometimes I think so often on social media we talk about self-care being like, "Oh, I'm gonna go run myself a bubble bath," or something like that. For me, at my worst, like, I wasn't taking care of myself at all. I wasn't showering, I wasn't eating at all, like, I stopped having the ability to eat solid food, so, self-care for me at that point was not having a bubble bath, it was not going for a walk, because I could barely get down the stairs in my own house. So for me, self-care sometimes just looks like getting out of bed, taking a shower, doing the dishes. And I know that sounds like really weird. It doesn't sound like it's self care, but to me, self care is about purpose. And if those things give me purpose, if those things are a win, then I gotta say that's what self care means to me. Sometimes it's a bubble bath, but sometimes it's literally just getting out of bed.
I like that answer. That goes with your mental health question as well. What does mental health mean to you? I always like asking people that because everyone's different, but it's all good to hear. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, okay, what does mental health mean to me? Like, I could give you, a technical definition,
Yep.
but I think everybody's gonna picture it a little bit differently in their own minds. So I think that's a really interesting question.
Let's wrap up with this. I like to ask all my guests this question. You're a big music person. What would be Heather Hutchinson's theme song?
Oh my gosh. What would be my theme song?
Yeah, you like pretend like you're like a pro boxer, pro wrestler. You come out to the crowd. What song's being played?
I it's really cheesy, but like maybe like Chariots of Fire or something like that's just super epic.
Yeah, see, that's perfect.
Like, I love to put it with, like, different videos of, like, just doing stupid things, like, I remember my friend and I were having a lawn tractor race that we videoed, and we put it to Chariots of Fire, and it just it makes everything epic.
It really does. It really does. Who won that race?
Um, I think it was me by a little bit, she beat me on the straight shots, but I cornered better, so
Fantastic. I like that. Yeah, professional lawnmower racer.
yeah, it's a thing.
Let's end with this. What are three things that you're grateful for today?
3 things that I'm grateful today. My cat, because she's awesome. Getting to do what I do, getting to even, have these conversations with people, that give me purpose. And I am also grateful for, hmm, for chai lattes because I'm thinking about going and having one right now.
Fantastic. Well, we skipped over this. What's your cat's name?
My cat is named Maya.
I like it. I'm a big cat person myself. I got two cats. That's how much I like them.
Oh, they're awesome. My cat actually, like, taught herself that if I drop something, she'll actually go find it for me and, like, tap it with her paw until I find it, so cats are the best.
That's what I'm saying. Cats are very underrated because everyone always has that dog cat debate and they're like, oh, dogs are way better. Cats suck. I'm like, no. Like, you can have a dog like you pretty easily, but having a cat warm up to you is a big victory.
It's totally yeah, like, it feels like an accomplishment, and I always say, like, my cats have always been more intuitive than my dogs. I love all the dogs that I've had, but my cats win in that area for sure.
Heather Hutchinson, thank you so much for coming on to 2010 Minutes. It's been a blast. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's been another episode of 2010 Minutes. Let's break the stigma by cracking a smile. I will see you soon.
Round one, fight!
All right, so I treat everybody equal on this show, and I do this thing with all of my guests before we record to get the blood pumping. I play a game of rock, paper, scissors against my guests. Would you want to play rock, paper, scissors against me?
Well, let's do it.
Hell yeah, hell yeah. So I'll call it. It's going to be rock, paper, scissors, shoot. A lot of people do it weirdly, but I want to make sure we're on the same page with that. But it's rock, paper, scissors, shoot. We're going to do 2 out of 3, and we'll go from there.
All right,
All right, let me know when you're ready.
go for it.
All right, rock, paper, scissors, shoot.
Paper.
I got rock. So you got 1-0.
All right,
All right. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot.
scissors.
Ooh, I got rock again. 1-1. 1-1. All right, here we go. Here we go. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot.
Rock.
Ah! I got scissors. I got scissors. Oh, good game. Good game.
This podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. If you are feeling suicidal, please dial 911.